I do believe that if European Union is going to be disintegrated, it's going to be really devastating experience for the European societies as a whole.
As you have been told, I'm Bulgarian. And according to the surveys, we are among the most pessimistic people in the world. The Economist magazine recently wrote an article covering one of the recent studies on happiness, and the title was "The Happy, the Unhappy, and the Bulgarians."
Some years ago, before the financial crisis, European Union was taken for granted. Further European integration was taken as a process which was as natural as gravitation. And it's not the case anymore. And I do believe that when I say after Europe, it does not mean that European Union simply is going to disappear. To be honest, it's important to notice that we have many theories of European integration, but we don't know exactly what this integration means. Okay, the fact that the United Kingdom decided to leave the Union, is this disintegration? If one or two countries are going to leave the Eurozone, at the same time, if nobody is leaving, but we are not going to have the freedom of movement, if some of the countries in the EU stop to be liberal democracy, is this disintegration? So I'm asking very much the questions that depends from where you look. Disintegration have a different meaning. Everybody remembers how the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed in 1918. But the interesting story is why it didn't collapse the previous 100 years, when people are saying that it should collapse, that structurally it's inefficient, and so on. I do believe that the very art of survival gives a legitimacy to a political project. So from this point of view, in order to regain some of its legitimacy, it is not needed for the European Union to be able to solve many of the issues that it faces today, but it is needed to survive, basically to convince the people that this is the best alternative that we have. I do believe that of all crises that Europe faced, the refugee crisis, the migration crisis, is the one that most profoundly is going to affect the future of the Union, because paradoxically, this is the only pan-European crisis. The problem with the refugee crisis, in my view, at least three. First, it's not the number of the people that came after 2015. From this point of view, there are around 2 million people that entered the European Union after 2015. This is not a huge number. European Union is a big place. There are more than 500 million people living there, and the refugees that you have in Europe coming from Syria, less than the ones that you have in Turkey these days. But like 9/11 in the US, 3,000 people being killed in New York was not the end of the world, but it did force Americans to re-perceive the world. In the same way, in my view, the refugee crisis pushed Europeans to see the world around us in a different way. If till yesterday the question was how we can transform our neighbors, the question now is how not to allow our neighbors to transform us. If you read the opinion polls today, one of the most pro-European public opinions are in Poland and Hungary. At the same time, they vote for the governments that are very hostile to the European Union and also which are very much dismantling some of the major institutions of a liberal democracy, starting with the constitutional courts and very much attacking the media. Why this is possible? Listen, we migrated to the West. Some of us with our countries, some of us individually, but for the last 25 years, basically, we adopted the legislation, the institutions, the way of life of the West. But as everybody who has been doing sociology of migration knows, while the first generation of migrants try basically and experience this type of imitation as success, the second became resentful. And this second generation, in a way, is much more Europeanized. Our societies are much more European than they have ever been. But then the questions comes, what happened to our national tradition? Are we treated as a second class of citizens? And then comes emotions, then comes the politics of pride. I was asking myself why people, and in Poland, if you see the governing party and the governing leaders, they're not much trusted by the population. Basically, this is quite divisive figure. So why people are ready to give so much power to certain politicians, why they're ready to allow them to take control over the public media, to take control over judiciary, why they're not afraid of this. For people on the street, separation of powers starts to be perceived as alibi for the elites to say what they cannot do.
We're not Eurosceptics. We're Euro-realists. We want the EU to be efficient. We want it to function properly so that it will foresee any possible future problems that are coming its way. It turns out that today's European Union has many weaknesses, and this needs to be fixed. Let's be honest, EU institutions are not the most democratic institutions. Everyone in Europe is saying this.
Because people vote differently, but then the governments come and said, I cannot change this because of the courts. I cannot change this because of the European Union. I cannot change this, because of that. And then people said, okay, if I'm electing a government that cannot change anything, it means that my vote doesn't matter. And the fact that over years in European Union, and particularly in Eastern Europe, we have been changing governments without changing policies, created a situation in which people decided, let's give much power to these political leaders in order to keep them accountable for what they're doing. The only problem with this way of thinking is that when you give so much power to somebody, you cannot be sure that he's ready to return the power back to you.